All right, so we're back from winter break. I hope everybody had a good break, some time off, a chance to sort of rest and recharge. Um, so what we're going to do today is we are going to sort of take our time to ease back into things a little bit. I didn't really like just the timing of the way um, that we finished the fall semester, and a lot of it was really out of our control with field trips and with testing and things like that. Those last couple weeks before finals really kind of got away from us. So what I'm going to do here today is we're going to do a little bit of wrap up over chapter 21, which was over the New Deal. I have in front of me the list of your questions, and what I'm going to seek to do here in about a half hour to maybe 40 minutes is go over some information with you that will maybe not answer your questions directly, and this is done on purpose. In other words, I'm not just going to say, hey, here's this question that was asked, and here's the direct answer to it. But instead, we're going to sort of take a holistic look at a couple of different sort of big topics, and hopefully that information can then sort of filter down to the questions that you all asked. And then you'll have an assignment where you'll need to take sort of the things that I'm going to talk about and cover here, and answer not just your own question, but then a couple of your classmates' questions as well. And I'll just say, just sort of right off the bat as we begin, that a number of your questions sort of fell into one of these two sort of big categories that I'm going to divide this up into. And the first one is FDR. Um, Roughly half of the questions had to do with just sort of FDR as either a person or FDR and the things that he did regarding the Depression, sort of what things made him popular. Let's see here. What were the actual measures that he did, or that he endeavored to sort of make sure that the United States undertook to sort of pull us out of the Depression. So that was the first one, and then the second one, and actually it's probably a little bit over half of your questions, just had to do with the Depression generally, the Great Depression generally. So the how, the why, the effects, and the recovery. Just again in some sort of form. So again, we're not going to answer your questions directly here, but all of your questions in some way sort of fell in one of these two categories, and that's sort of what we're going to talk about here in this short video. So we're going to dive into, first of all, the figure of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He is a cousin to Teddy Roosevelt. I believe he's a fifth cousin to Teddy Roosevelt. So he is tied in with the larger Roosevelt family. The larger Roosevelt family was a fairly wealthy and a fairly influential family in New York. Theodore was at one point the governor of New York in the late 1890s, the early 1890s. He then transitioned to national office in the late 1890s, largely because the New York State Legislature felt that TR was kind of annoying. Franklin is, again, a distant cousin, okay? But he comes from a fair bit of wealth, a fair bit of influence. A little bit more extreme version of Roosevelt, or of Teddy Roosevelt, rather. Teddy was famously asthmatic as a child, relatively weak. That's why he ascribed to sort of this, what he called the strenuous life. Franklin was bound to a wheelchair for much of the latter portion of his life. He succumbed to polio, and couldn't really lead this vigorous life that maybe his cousin did. And he was very aware of the public perception that would point out there, or that would put out there. He is never seen in public in his wheelchair. We see very rarely we will see a photograph of Roosevelt in his wheelchair. When he would make speeches, many times there would be sort of elevated platforms behind the massive podiums that Roosevelt would appear on. And again, that was to sort of give the illusion of him standing. Later on in his life, and when the next topic that we have to cover, obviously, is World War II. When Roosevelt walks into Congress to make his speech requesting that Congress declare war on Japan, he actually will walk in using his son, one of his sons, as sort of a crutch, because he understands that what the country needed to see at that point was a picture and a vision of strength and stability, and not of weakness. And he perceived that, coming in a wheelchair would be understood as weak. So he understood public perception probably better than any other president, even better than his predecessor cousin, Theodore. He also is going to engage in fireside chats to go to these public perceptions. He uses radio better. Really, for the first time, he sort of revolutionizes the way that the president uses mass media in the form of the radio. And he starts these things called fireside chats, where he recognizes that with the 1920s, while it put while the boom of the 1920s, for a number of different reasons that we'll talk about here in a second, put the United States into the Depression, he also understood that the consumer goods, for example, the radio, could be used for political gain. So now he's going to become really the first personal president, right? Because you can literally be sitting in your living room at any place in the country, turn on your radio, and you can hear the president's voice, which is really something that we take for granted now in an age of media at our fingertips. Roosevelt, FDR, that is, was the first president to really make use of that through his fireside chats, right? Really a source of comfort for people in the midst of this terrible economic depression. Roosevelt, it says there, was by nature a pragmatist. And we talked about pragmatism a little bit at the beginning of the course, but remember, pragmatists are ones that sort of believe in the power of human reason and human rationality to solve problems. And he is known by many now intellectual historians as the great tinkerer. FDR was more willing than his predecessors to just sort of mess around with the economy, mess around with small little parts to see what the effect on the whole was, and then also to sort of pilot larger programs that might be important. And just sort of by nature of that, he's more willing to allow the government to be more active in the economy. We see this sort of throughout, where presidential power has been sort of growing, but it's really been a legislative power. It hasn't really been an economic power. And so Roosevelt, FDR, that is really the first one to say, you know what, we need to adhere to what's called Keynesian economics, and that's where it says there he's a Keynesian. He believes that the government must take a more active role in the economy. Now, Keynesians, by the way, that's named for an economist whose name is Albert. I believe it's Albert Keynes. I could have the first name wrong, but he believes essentially that governments on large scale must spend money in order to keep the economy afloat. In other words, economies have become so large that they cannot run on their own anymore. And I'm greatly simplifying this down. You can read about it's John Maynard Keynes. I'm sorry, it's not Albert. John Maynard Keynes. You can read up on John Maynard Keynes at your leisure, and we will talk more about Keynesianism as we move forward past World War II and into the 1950s. But Roosevelt he's going to take a stance that the government needs to interject itself, and this is different than Harding. This is different than Coolidge. This is different than Hoover. Hoover's the immediate predecessor to Roosevelt, because they all believed sort of in sort of that Adam Smith, that invisible hand, that the market will correct itself. We just need to practice patience and prudence and all that. And Roosevelt certainly had the personality to back all of this up, right? There's a lot of unease just generally out there, and Roosevelt had this demeanor about him that was very calming. It was very soothing. You know, and to a lot of people, it made sense. There are people out there, and we'll talk about this more in a minute. There's people in not just urban areas, as you saw in the movie Cinderella Man, who are struggling, but rural areas especially are, they had a sort of a sneak preview of the Depression in the 1920s, right? Things in rural areas have not been good for a long time. And Roosevelt sort of has this demeanor where he's very calming, he's very soothing. We're here now. The government is here to help, rather than simply be an idle sort of observer of the economy, right? So that's sort of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And implicit in what we're going to talk about moving forward is sort of what does Roosevelt specifically do. So we're going to get more into his New Deal and alphabet soup programs here in a moment. Now, moving forward to the Depression. So the how. It started as a mild recession, and you can find charts and graphs and different things like that. Recessions are just sort of periods of slight regression in an economy. There is this thing called the natural business cycle, and that's sort of Hoover, who's the immediate predecessor to FDR. Hoover believes that the Depression is merely nothing more, at least initially, and Hoover does change his tune towards the end of his term, but it's by far too late. Hoover initially believes that the beginnings of the Depression is just a mild recession, that it's just sort of this downturn, this natural downturn that was bound to happen. And a lot of you saw this when we played the stock market game there at the beginning of sort of our section on the 1920s, where things go up and up and up. At some point, they have to go down. And that's sort of what Hoover believed, and many Republicans, many people, just general, many business people believe this is just a mild recession. You can see down there at the bottom of why it's just part of the natural business cycle, right? In terms then of how the Depression goes from this mild recession to the Depression, largely panic, and you kind of get that there on that fourth bullet point. And there's a number of different factors, and it all depends on who you ask. Some people say that it was the banks. It was the bank's fault, and we talked about bank. I don't know if we talked about bank runs in this class or not, but you have bank runs where the stock market takes this little dip, and because it takes this dip, which little by comparison to what's about to happen at the time, it's certainly a large dip. When it takes this dip, because everybody sort of has bought on credit, people start to panic, and they go and they try to pull their money out of banks, because there is there's comfort in sort of the physical possession of your money. And because the banks had also invested, they didn't have the cash on hand, and there were no protections on banks. Banks were largely what we call unregulated or deregulated, right? The government didn't have requirements on the amount of cash that you needed to have on hand and things like that. So a lot of historians and a lot of economists will blame banks. A lot of historians and a lot of economists will blame the government for not having the regulations that they should have had in place, or the regulations that we now have in place. And of course, the counter argument to that is, well, why would you? Why would you need to monitor the banks? Why would you need to monitor the stock market? Because things have really just kind of taken care of themselves to this point. So it really depends on who you ask as to, how did it start? Well, it started as a mild recession, but then how did it turn into this huge panic that we now know as the Great Depression? Well, there's a number of different factors, and it really depends on who you ask, right? Now, the why, again, there's this natural business cycle, which we already sort of touched on. There's then this overconfidence in the market, and the overconfidence in the market is the overconfidence in the unregulated market, right? And that's where it says down there in that second to bottom point, where it says, because we have overconfidence in the market, we have an overconfidence in private, unregulated business, right? That business will solve all of our problems. Why do we have that belief? Well, again, look at the arc of the 1920s, right? Things have been going so well here in the 1920s, and private businesses, your Rockefellers, your Carnegies, they have been sort of the impetus for this, right? And maybe at times it comes at the cost of workers' rights and workers' pay and things like that. But things are we have this confidence because things have been going really pretty well, right? Um, and then the last one there is credit, and that can't be overstated. Um, here in the 2000s, especially, the credit crisis has become sort of a buzzword, right? Um, there's people that have literally thousands upon thousands of dollars in credit card debt, and people wonder, why does this happen? Well, the sad fact of it is that this is not the first time that this has happened, and we saw this with the opportunity for margin buying, right? And the margin buying was not just on the stock market. You could buy household appliances on credit. You could buy cars, the automobile. You could buy those obviously on credit, right? And this was sort of a new thing that was exciting for the average consumer because for the first time you can buy these goods that were largely believed to be really for the wealthy. But at the same time, you don't really have the knowledge and the understanding of how credit works in the long term, right? So there's a lot of, in terms of the how and the why, there's a lot of ignoring sort of the long-term ramifications of short-term decisions that really is the impetus for the depression, right? So we have the how, we have the why. Now we get into the effects and then the recovery, right? Well, the effects are obviously catastrophic, right? And you saw Cinderella Man's a great example of sort of the urban, middle, and lower classes and the struggles that they had. But farmers, so your rural areas, they are hit especially hard, right? Farmers had been defaulting on their farm loans for years, reaching all the way back into the 1920s and really even into the 19 teens, right? So farmers especially struggle, and a lot of that has to do with mechanization, right? Um, you have sort of increased rates of poverty in rural areas, and we talked a little bit about that. Sort of that flow of labor, right? That as you have the rise of the factory, sort of implicit in all that is sort of the fall of the family farm, right? So farmers get hit especially hard. They then, and this is not up here on this on the slide, but sort of happening concurrently is the Dust Bowl. So not only are you getting hit hard economically, where you're not able to pay your mortgage, but now you can't even get a decent crop because you have drought-like conditions. There was overplanting of the soil, which led to erosion, increased erosion, both water, but more prevalently wind. There are literally 6 to 12 inches of topsoil in places like Kansas and Nebraska that are blown as far away as Oklahoma and Nevada and Colorado. Like literally 6 to 12 inches of topsoil just gone, right? So not only do you have the economics of sort of supply and demand and what have you, but now you also have drought-like conditions, right? The wealthy are easy targets because they are wealthy, right? But even the wealthy are going to struggle. They're going to see loss of investment. They're going to see loss of personal wealth that had been stockpiled. Now, again, it's not nearly. I mean, I don't want to sit here and make it out to be like the wealthy had it off terribly because they didn't. But they did. There was struggle on the part of the wealthy. Even though they are easy targets because they're wealthy, and all of a sudden you have within the span of a couple of years you have a vast majority of the people that have been hit incredibly hard by this economic depression. And the biggest issue with the depression, by the way, was unemployment. That's not something that's up there. That's something that's implicit in all of this because, as we talked, not everybody invested in the stock market. Not everybody bought on credit. But the problem is that as the depression sort of deepens, you have the loss of jobs. Businesses go bankrupt. They go out of business. Banks go bankrupt. People lose their entire fortunes or their entire all of their money that they had invested in banks that were sort of these trusted financial institutions. And then on top of that, because the banks are going under, businesses start to then go under as well. And now you have massive unemployment. At one point, and the movie actually has a headline. It's another one of those little details that's sort of under the surface, but that the movie shows a headline where unemployment at one point reaches 25%, which 25% is kind of a stretch, but it was certainly well into the 20s of percentages. So again, the effects are just absolutely catastrophic. We've never seen unemployment numbers like that since, and hopefully never will again. Now, the recovery. Again, FDR comes in and he is viewed as a hero, right? And we're going to get into those dirt road Democrats here in a second. But first, how is FDR viewed as a hero? Well, from your readings, you hopefully picked up on the New Deal, the first New Deal, where FDR says, "Look, we're going to create these recovery programs, right? We're going to create these relief programs, relief, recovery, and reform are sort of the three R's of the New Deal." Relief programs are these short-term programs that are designed to provide immediate relief, sort of like a Band-Aid, an immediate Band-Aid. And then your recovery programs are like if you go in, you have that large wound that you put a Band-Aid on to stop the bleeding. Now you go into the doctor, and the recovery is like the doctor actually stitching the wound up so that it can heal. And then the reform those are sort of longer term programs that are designed to change behavior, right? So if you go back to the analogy that I've begun to draw out, you have the relief, which is the Band-Aid to stop the bleeding. The recovery is you go into the hospital and the doctor stitches it up. The reform then is when you go back to whatever it was that you were doing when you got hurt. The reform is that you change your pattern of behavior so that nothing like that happens again. That's sort of the basic outline that FDR sort of envisioned. Now, as we'll get into here in a second, this does not go completely according to plan for a number of different factors that we'll get into here in a minute. But FDR is viewed as a hero because of sort of his short-term, relief efforts. You see the term there, dirt road Democrats. Dirt road Democrats, Roosevelt as a Democrat he is viewed as a hero by all, but especially those in rural areas because of things like the TVA, which is the Tennessee Valley Authority, because of things like the AAA, which is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. People in these rural areas, they latch on to Roosevelt as an absolute hero, right? And so a dirt road Democrat is somebody who latches on to FDR's economic policies, and FDR as sort of this great tinkerer with the federal economy. And they view him as sort of their economic savior of sorts, right? And they are going to venerate Roosevelt, right? They have this diehard love of him to the point where, they're going to not only venerate Roosevelt, but they're then also going to venerate his party, right? The Democratic Party. And as it says there, the New Deal is viewed immediately as wildly successful, right? Initial unemployment numbers go down, not to where they need to go, but they go down fairly significantly. So you go from unemployment up in the 20s to unemployment that's in the teens, which again is quite the improvement. Now, in the long term, there are some cracks that start to develop. And we'll talk a little bit more later about specific issues like Social Security, for example. But suffice it to say that a lot of the programs that Roosevelt espoused were not meant to be long-term, okay? They were meant to be relief or recovery programs. They were not meant to be reform programs. They were not meant to last perpetually or forever, right? And as time goes on, those programs are where the cracks in the in the New Deal begin to develop, right? Because a lot of these programs were never curtailed. And the question becomes, well, why were they never curtailed? Well, because people began to rely on them, right? Great example is the CCC, which is the Civilian Conservation Corps, right? those were designed to be short-term jobs, right? And they're great because in the short term, they give people jobs. They're going to build, the Works Progress Administration is another one. These programs are going to put young men, typically young single men, to work all around the country, doing different jobs, building infrastructure and things like that. Well, the problem is that once you build that infrastructure up, where do those jobs go? Well, they kind of disappear because there's only so much infrastructure that you can build, right? And so that's just one example of how these are programs that are meant to be short term, but there's not always the follow through in terms of those medium to longer range plans for how to pull us out of the depression. So just to sort of wrap up, as we're sort of putting a bow on chapter 21 and then transitioning into chapter 22, which is the United States in World War II. One of the questions that I don't think was asked directly, but it is a pretty common one, is did the New Deal bring us out of the Depression? Most scholars today are going to answer no. Most historians today are going to say some version of no. Either no, it absolutely did not take us out of the Depression, or they're going to say, well, it helped, but it couldn't do it on its own. You had to have something else to sort of put it over the top. And that something else, as we're going to find as we get into chapter 22, is World War II, America's involvement in World War II. But certainly the New Deal was critical in terms of, at the very least, sort of stopping the bleeding of the Depression. Now, where we go from there, well, that in terms of success or failure really depends on who you ask, right? And that's a different conversation for a different day. For now, I've hit it about 25, 26, 27 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. You'll have your assignment in Classroom that will be due at the date and time that it says there in Classroom. So please follow that to a T. And then I will see you guys hopefully on Tuesday when I return.